The city burned quietly beneath him. Park Joon-hyuk stood alone in his penthouse, drenched in silence as news anchors screamed in the background, global markets collapsing, political figures resigning, arrest warrants issued worldwide. His name echoing from every screen. Cut to a rain-soaked night. Screams, glass shattering, a woman's silhouette dissolving into the downpour. He stopped for 10 seconds. She vanished without a goodbye. Now governments are searching for her. And his name is everywhere. Deals made in shadows, a body beneath the water, the truth wrapped in blood and gold. He saved her because he thought he was strong enough. He was wrong. It's a new year, and while others scroll past stories like this, you stayed. That means you care, you feel. You don't want to miss moments that remind us we're alive. So subscribe, join this family, and tell me where you're watching from. Your presence matters more than you think today. Rain fell on Seoul like a confession no one wanted to hear. Park Joon-hyuk watched it through the windshield of his black Genesis G90, the wipers beating a rhythm that matched nothing inside him. The city blurred past, neon signs bleeding into wet concrete, late-night food stalls closing their shutters, salarymen stumbling toward subway stations with umbrellas that had already surrendered to the wind. He should have been home an hour ago. The quarterly reports waited on his desk, annotated in his CFO's nervous handwriting. His phone held 17 unread messages from board members who couldn't agree on anything except their collective distrust of each other. But Joon-hyuk had taken the long way through Itaewon, past streets he used to know before money had rebuilt his geography entirely. The traffic light turned red. He saw her. She stood on the corner of an intersection that led nowhere important. A woman in a gray coat too thin for October, holding a manila envelope against her chest like a shield. The rain had soaked through the fabric at her shoulders, darkening it to charcoal. Her hair, some indeterminate shade between brown and black, clung to her face in wet strands she didn't bother pushing away. What struck him wasn't her stillness. Seoul was full of people waiting, for buses, for calls, for lives to begin. It was her eyes. They tracked every car that passed, every pedestrian, every shadow that moved too quickly in the periphery. Not with fear, but with calculation. She was counting threats the way he counted assets. The light turned green. His foot hesitated on the accelerator. Don't. The word formed in his mind with his father's voice, that dead man's pragmatism that had kept their family fed during years when hunger was more than metaphor. His father had taught him that strangers were equations, and the ones who didn't solve cleanly were the ones that cost you everything. The car behind him honked. She didn't flinch at the sound. Her gaze swept toward his vehicle, held for precisely 2 seconds, then dismissed him. Something about that dismissal, the efficiency of it, the absolute absence of hope, made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt since burying his mother. He pulled to the curb. "You're going to regret this." She watched him roll down the window, rain misting into the leather interior. Her expression remained unchanged, neither grateful nor afraid. Just waiting. "You need a ride?" His Korean felt strange in his mouth, too formal for the situation. "No." She didn't elaborate, didn't explain why she was standing in a downpour at 11 o'clock on a Thursday, clutching documents that might be everything or nothing. "The rain isn't stopping," he said. "I noticed." Her accent caught his attention, Korean, but shaped by something else. Time spent elsewhere, perhaps, running from something, toward something he couldn't tell. The envelope in her arms was thick. Legal documents, maybe. The kind of paper that changed lives or ended them. Leave. He unlocked the passenger door. She stared at the handle for a long moment, and he saw her calculating. Routes, risks, the weight of a decision she couldn't undo. Then she opened the door and slid inside, bringing the smell of rain and something faintly metallic, like old coins or dried blood. "Where?" he asked. "Anywhere that isn't here." They didn't speak for 12 blocks. Joon-hyuk drove without destination, navigating streets he'd memorized decades ago before he'd become the kind of man who had drivers and could afford to forget how the city breathed. She sat with her spine straight, the envelope on her lap, her fingers pressed flat against it, as if to keep its contents from escaping. He noticed her eyes in his peripheral vision. They checked the mirrors, the door locks, the phone mounted on his dashboard. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "People who say that usually do." "Fair enough." He pulled into a convenience store parking lot, the fluorescent lights casting both their faces in unflattering honesty. She looked younger up close, maybe 30, maybe less. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of nights spent on edges. "I have an apartment," he said, then heard how that sounded. "Unused. For business guests who never come. You can stay tonight." "Why?" The question held no suspicion, just genuine curiosity, as if she were studying him the way he studied acquisition targets. "Because you haven't asked me for anything," he said, "and people who don't ask usually need the most." She considered this, then nodded once, precisely, like signing a contract. "Nancy," she said, "my name." "Joon-hyuk." The apartment was in Hanam-dong, 17 floors above streets that cost more per square meter than most people earned in a year. He'd bought it through a subsidiary 3 years ago, part of a real estate portfolio that existed primarily on spreadsheets. The elevator ride was silent. Inside, the space looked exactly as he'd left it. White walls, minimal furniture, windows that offered views of a city that never fully darkened. It felt less like a home than a held breath. "Bathroom is through there," he said. "Bedroom has clean sheets. There's some food in the refrigerator, probably expired." Nancy walked through the room slowly, touching nothing, memorizing everything. She checked the closets, opened the balcony door, looked down at the 17-story drop, closed it again. "No second exit," she said. "No." "I'll take the couch." He made tea because he didn't know what else to do. She accepted the cup without thanks, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. The envelope sat beside her on the coffee table, its presence loud in the quiet room. "You're not going to ask what's in it," she said. "Should I?" "Most people would." "I'm not most people." She almost smiled. It didn't reach her eyes, but it softened something around her mouth. A crack in armor she'd been wearing so long she'd probably forgotten it wasn't skin. They sat in silence while the rain continued its argument with the windows. Somewhere below, the city hummed its late-night frequency, taxis and subway announcements and the distant bass of clubs that wouldn't close until dawn. "You're too calm," she said finally. "Men who pick up women from street corners at midnight are either predators or fools. You don't seem like either." "What do I seem like?" She studied him over the rim of her cup. "Someone who hasn't decided yet." At 1:30, exhaustion settled over both of them like a truce. Joon-hyuk stood by the window, watching the rain thin to a drizzle. Behind him, Nancy had pulled her legs onto the couch, her eyes finally closed, though he doubted she was sleeping. The envelope remained within arm's reach. His phone vibrated. The message was from his legal team, the encrypted channel they used for matters that couldn't exist in ordinary correspondence. He read it once, then again, his reflection in the dark glass going very still. Unusual background checks initiated on subsidiary HNV-127. Foreign agency protocols detected. Timestamp 22:47. He looked at the time. 22:47 was exactly when he'd stopped at the intersection, the same moment he'd seen her standing in the rain. Joon-hyuk turned slowly, watching the woman on his couch breathe with the studied regularity, of someone pretending to sleep. The envelope, her calculated stillness, the way she'd tracked exits like a professional. The coincidence settled in his stomach like something swallowed that wouldn't digest. "She found you," whispered his father's voice. "You just haven't figured out how yet." She was awake before him. Joon-hyuk found Nancy standing at the window, morning light cutting across her face in thin blades. She'd found the coffee maker, the cup in her hands steamed gently, and changed into a clean shirt from the closet. His shirt. The sleeves hung past her wrists, making her look smaller than she was. "The news is wrong," she said without turning. He stopped in the doorway. "Which news?" "The financial segment. They reported Hanuel Industries posted gains in the Southeast Asian corridor last quarter." She finally looked at him. "But I watched their subsidiary filings 3 months ago. The numbers don't match. Someone restructured their debt and buried the adjustment in a Singaporean holding shell." Joon-hyuk felt the coffee he hadn't drunk yet turn cold in his imagination. "You follow Korean corporate filings," he said carefully. "From where?" "Everywhere." She turned back to the window. "Numbers don't lie, but the people arranging them do." Breakfast was instant ramyeon and silence. She ate economically, wasting nothing, her eyes occasionally drifting to her phone, a device he noticed she never unlocked in his presence. The envelope from last night remained sealed on the coffee table, a paper wound neither of them acknowledged. "You're not a journalist," he said. "No." "Lawyer?" "Close." She pushed the empty bowl aside. "I was a compliance auditor, forensic financial analysis. Companies hired me to find problems before regulators did." "Was." The word hung between them like smoke. "I found the wrong problem," she said. "For the wrong people." She asked questions throughout the morning, never direct, always circling. How do shell companies typically layer their ownership structures? What happens when cross-border transactions don't reconcile? If a model showed statistical anomalies in fund transfers, who would notice first? Joon-hyuk answered some, deflected others. He watched her absorb information the way he watched analysts consume market data, hungrily, systematically, building architecture in her mind that he couldn't see. "You're testing me," he said finally. "I'm deciding whether to trust you." "And?" She looked at him with those calculating eyes. "The jury is still out." By noon, Joon-hyuk's own calculations had begun. He sat at the apartment's small desk, laptop open, running searches he shouldn't have been running on a Saturday. His memory conjured deals from years past, acquisitions he'd approved without full review, investment structures his CFO had championed as tax efficient. The patterns Nancy described, layered shells, mismatched reconciliations, buried adjustments, they echoed in his corporate history like footsteps in an empty building. Dyson Capital, 2019, a real estate fund he'd absorbed during expansion. The due diligence had been rushed. Someone else handled the details. Pacific Rim Holdings, 2021, a logistics network acquired through a consortium. He'd signed the final authorization, never questioning why certain subsidiaries existed only on paper. HNV 127. The shell company flagged in last night's message. It was supposed to be dormant, a corporate skeleton left over from restructuring. Why was someone running background checks on a corpse? The knock came at 2:47 p.m. Joon-hyuk's body reacted before his mind. He was on his feet, hand raised for silence, watching Nancy go completely still. Her coffee cup lowered to the table without a sound. Her eyes found the door, then the balcony, then the hallway leading to the bedroom. Calculating exits. Again. The knock repeated. Polite, patient. He moved to the peephole. 2 men stood in the hallway, navy suits, expensive cut. One held a leather portfolio. The other kept his hands visible, a gesture that somehow felt more threatening than concealment. "Mr. Park," the first man called. We're hoping you can help us locate a missing consultant. Our firm is quite concerned about her well-being. Joon-hyuk didn't move. Her name is Nancy Hale, the man continued. She's been under significant stress. We simply want to ensure she's receiving proper care. Behind him, Nancy had already moved, silently, efficiently, pulling on shoes, grabbing the envelope. She met his eyes and shook her head once. Don't open it. He didn't. I'm sorry, he called through the door. I don't know anyone by that name. You must have the wrong apartment. Silence stretched for a long moment. Of course, the man said. Our apologies for the disturbance. If you do happen to encounter her, please let us know. She's carrying sensitive materials that don't belong to her. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. The elevator chimed distantly. Nancy exhaled. They found me faster than I expected, she said. I need to leave, now. The second apartment was in Mapo-gu, purchased through a different subsidiary, registered under a name that didn't connect to him on any searchable database. They arrived before sunrise painted the Han River orange. The drive had been tense. Nancy watched every vehicle that passed, every traffic camera that blinked. She held the envelope against her chest like armor. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light of another sparse room, she finally cracked. I worked for a consortium, she said, sitting on the edge of an unused bed. International compliance. They hired me to audit their fund transfer networks, look for inefficiencies, regulatory risks, normal corporate housekeeping. Joon-hyuk leaned against the door frame. But you found something else. I found ghosts. Her voice flattened. Transactions that should have been there weren't. Money that arrived from nowhere and vanished the same way. Entities that existed just long enough to move capital, then dissolved like smoke. Money laundering. Worse. She opened the envelope for the first time. Documents spilled across the bed. Spreadsheets, organizational charts, communication logs. Joon-hyuk recognized the format of Korean corporate filings, but the names attached to them meant nothing. Nothing, until she pointed to a specific entry. This shell company received funds from a network that's been linked to weapons trafficking in Southeast Asia, she said. The money moved through Singapore, then Hong Kong, then Seoul. And this, her finger traced a line of text, is the authorization signature that made it legal. Joon-hyuk stared at the document. The signature was his. The room went very quiet. I didn't know, he heard himself say. They never do. Nancy gathered the documents carefully, precisely. The people at the top sign what they're told to sign. The structure protects them from understanding what they're approving. That's the whole point. Then why tell me? She looked up, and for the first time he saw something other than calculation in her eyes. Exhaustion, maybe, or the first fragile edge of hope. Because you picked me up in the rain, she said. Because you didn't ask what was in the envelope. Because the men hunting me work for people who are already inside your company, and you're the only one who might be positioned to stop them. Joon-hyuk felt the floor shift beneath him. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. He'd built his empire on controlled risk, on calculated moves and strategic patience. He'd never been reckless, never been impulsive, never allowed emotion to override analysis. Last night he'd unlocked his car door for a stranger. This morning he'd become an accessory to whatever she was running from. And now, staring at his own signature authorizing funds that might have bought bullets in countries he'd never visited, he understood something fundamental. This was no longer charity. Helping her meant declaring war on shadows that already knew his face, his signature, his weaknesses. They knew where he lived, where he worked, who he trusted. And somewhere in his own organization, someone had been using his name as a weapon long before he'd stopped on that rain-soaked corner. What happens now? He asked. Nancy sealed the envelope again, her movements precise. Now you decide, she said. "Are you a man who signs what he's told to sign? Or are you something else?" Joon-hyuk looked at the documents, at her, at the city waking beyond the window, full of people who had no idea what structures moved their money, shaped their choices, ended their lives. "I don't know," he admitted. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years, and that honesty, he knew, had already made him an enemy of people who traded in silence. 3 days passed in the Mapogu apartment like water finding cracks in stone. They developed rhythms without discussing them. Nancy took mornings by the window, watching the street below with coffee going cold in her hands. Joon-hyuk worked afternoons on his laptop, pretending to manage a company that suddenly felt like a stranger's possession. Evenings belonged to silence, the kind that grows between people who have too much to say and no safe way to say it. On the 4th night, he told her the truth. "I'm not just a businessman." Nancy looked up from the documents she'd been reorganizing for the 100th time. The envelope's contents now lived in careful stacks across the kitchen table, a paper autopsy of corruption she'd been dissecting for days. "I know who you are," she said. "I knew before I got in your car." The words landed like a physical blow. "Then why?" "Because I needed to see." She set down the page in her hands. "The reports I compiled, the structures I mapped, they were abstractions. Numbers and signatures and corporate shells. I needed to understand what kind of person existed at the center of it all." Joon-hyuk felt something cold settle in his chest. "And what did you find?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, her reflection ghosting against the night-lit city beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger, only disappointment. "I found someone who wasn't paying attention," she said. "Someone who built walls so high he couldn't see what was happening in his own foundation. Someone who signed documents without reading them because reading them would have meant responsibility. I didn't know. That's the problem." She turned to face him. "You didn't know because you chose not to know. Because not knowing was comfortable, because ignorance let you sleep at night while the money you moved bought weapons and silence and people's lives." The accusation hung between them, precise as surgery. Joon-hyuk had prepared himself for rage, for shouting, for threats, for the righteous fury of someone wronged by systems he'd helped build. He could have defended himself against anger, but this quiet devastation, this measured acknowledgement of his failure, left him with nothing. "You're right," he said. She didn't speak to him for 2 days after that. Not out of cruelty, he realized, but processing. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, eating little, sleeping less, her eyes carrying the weight of recalibrated understanding. On the 2nd night, he found her sitting on the kitchen floor at 3 a.m., documents spread around her like fallen leaves. "I used to imagine you," she said without looking up. "Not you specifically. The person, the type, the man in the expensive suit who signed the papers that made everything possible." Joon-hyuk lowered himself to the floor across from her, his back against the refrigerator. The tile was cold through his clothes. "I imagined someone cruel," she continued. "Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. A villain I could hate cleanly without complication." She finally met his eyes. "It would have been easier if you were that person." "I'm sorry I'm not." "So am I." Intimacy arrived without permission. Not physical, nothing so simple. But something shifted in the spaces between them. Shared insomnia became shared silence, became shared shame. He told her about his father, who'd taught him that survival meant never looking too closely at the machinery keeping you alive. She told him about her mother, who'd cleaned offices in buildings owned by men who never learned her name. "We were born on opposite sides of a wall," Nancy said one evening, both of them exhausted on the couch, the city humming its indifferent song beyond the windows. "You climbed it from one direction. I tried to tear it down from the other. And now?" Now we're both trapped in the rubble. He offered her everything he had. Private security, safe houses in 3 countries, accounts that couldn't be traced, lawyers who specialized in making people disappear legally, permanently, completely. "I can get you out," he said. "Tonight. You'd never have to look over your shoulder again." Nancy studied him with those calculating eyes, but something softer lived in them now, something that recognized him as more than a signature on corrupted documents. "And the evidence?" she asked. "The people still running the network? The money still moving through shells with your name attached?" "Someone else can fight that battle." "Who?" He had no answer. "That's what I thought." She gathered the documents, straightening them into the envelope that had become her constant companion. "I didn't spend 2 years building this case to disappear. I didn't lose everything, my job, my home, my name, just to accept comfortable silence from a man who feels guilty." "This isn't guilt, isn't it?" The question stopped him cold. Was it guilt? Was that why he'd unlocked his car door for a stranger in the rain? Why he'd moved her twice, lied to men in expensive suits, risked his company and his freedom for someone he barely knew? Or was it something else entirely? "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "But it stopped being about guilt the moment I saw my signature on those documents. Now it's about—" "What?" He struggled for words that didn't exist in his vocabulary of acquisitions and quarterly reports. "Accountability," he finally said. "I spent my whole life building something I thought was mine. Turns out I was just holding the door open for people I never saw. Now I have to decide what that means." Nancy was quiet for a long moment. "And what does it mean?" "It means I'm not trying to control this anymore." He looked at her, really looked, seeing past the guarded posture and calculated movements to the exhausted woman beneath. "I'm trying to protect you. Not because you need protection, because protecting you is the first honest thing I've done in years." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the first fragile recognition of being seen. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said softly. "I'm not promising anything. I'm just telling you what's true." He woke to absence. The apartment felt wrong before he opened his eyes. Too still, too empty, the particular silence that follows departure rather than sleep. He knew before he checked the couch, before he searched the bathroom, before he stood in the kitchen staring at the table where documents had lived for days. Gone, all of it. No note, no message, no explanation. Just the ghost of coffee lingering in the air and a single page left on the counter. Not from her evidence, but from his own corporate records. A document he didn't remember printing. It was the organizational chart for HNV 127. Someone had circled a name in red ink, a name he recognized, his CFO. The man who'd been with him for 15 years, who'd recommended every acquisition Nancy had flagged, who'd structured every shell company that now haunted Joon-hyuk's signature. She'd left him a map, but she hadn't trusted him to follow it with her. Joon-hyuk stood in the empty apartment as morning light crept across the floor, and the city beyond the windows, the city he'd thought he understood, thought he owned in some small way, suddenly felt like enemy territory. Every car could be watching, every face could be calculating, every shadow could be waiting for him to make the wrong move, and somewhere in that hostile landscape, Nancy was running. Alone. Because she'd decided that even his protection came with a price she wasn't willing to pay. The silence pressed against him like water, and for the first time in his adult life, Joon-hyuk understood what it meant to be truly afraid. Not for his empire or his reputation, but for someone who had looked at his failures and stayed anyway. Someone who had seen him clearly and still left a door open. Someone he might never find again. The collapse began with whispers. Joon-hyuk watched his empire fracture from the 37th floor of his headquarters, coffee growing cold in hands that had stopped feeling anything. The calls started at dawn. Board members demanding explanations, investors threatening withdrawal, lawyers speaking in the careful language of men preparing for disaster. By noon, regulatory agencies in 4 countries had initiated audits. By evening, 3 major deals had evaporated like morning fog. The media circled like patient vultures, their headlines crafting narratives from fragments they didn't understand. Park Industries under investigation. Financial irregularities suspected. CEO unavailable for comment. His phone displayed 47 missed calls. His email held hundreds of messages marked urgent. His CFO, the man whose name Nancy had circled in red, had resigned effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The rats always knew when to abandon ship. The connection revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in darkness. Someone had leaked documents to financial regulators in Singapore. Someone had tipped off investigative journalists in Seoul. Someone had coordinated a simultaneous exposure across multiple jurisdictions, ensuring that no single authority could suppress the story. The timing was surgical. Exactly 72 hours after Nancy disappeared. Joon-hyuk sat in his office long after his staff had fled, piecing together the strategy with growing understanding. She hadn't run from him. She'd run towards something, a plan she'd been building before they ever met, before a rainy intersection had tangled their trajectories together. Her disappearance wasn't escape, it was ignition. By leaving, she'd drawn the hunters after her, giving the evidence time to reach the right hands. By vanishing, she'd become a ghost that couldn't be silenced, a source that couldn't be pressured, a witness that couldn't be found. She'd used herself as bait. And she'd done it without telling him because she knew he would have tried to stop her. The message arrived on the 5th day, not through his phone or email or any channel the men in expensive suits might monitor. It came through an old account he'd forgotten, a personal blog he'd maintained briefly in his 20s before success had stripped away such ordinary vulnerabilities, a comment on a post about his mother's garden, anonymous, time-stamped 3 days earlier. The seeds take time to grow. Sometimes the gardener has to leave before the flowers bloom. Thank you for the water. Thank you for the sunlight. Thank you for reminding me that some walls have doors. The evidence is with people who won't bury it. The investigation will find what it needs to find. You'll have choices to make. I can't make them for you. I used to imagine what the man at the center looked like. Now I know. He looked like someone who stopped for a stranger in the rain. He looked like someone who carried shame instead of excuses. He looked like someone who deserved better than the architecture built around him. Don't let them make you disappear, too. Some debts can't be repaid. Some gifts can't be returned. Some people change you so completely that gratitude stops being enough. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope the man you become doesn't forget the man you were when you unlocked that door. Thank you. Not for saving my life, but for reminding me why it mattered. Joon-hyuk read the message 7 times. Then he closed the laptop and wept. The choice arrived wrapped in legal language. His remaining lawyers, the ones who hadn't fled, laid it out with clinical precision. Cooperate fully with investigators, provide all requested documentation, and accept reduced charges. The company would survive in diminished form. His personal liability would be manageable. Life would continue, quieter and smaller, but intact. Or, there's another option, his lead counsel said carefully. The investigation is focused on specific subsidiaries. If you were to proactively disclose information beyond what's been requested, internal communications, approval chains, the full network of shell structures, the exposure would be significantly more comprehensive. Comprehensive meaning what? Meaning criminal charges become more likely. Against you. Against people who currently remain protected. The regulatory response would be severe, institutional, the kind of investigation that takes years and destroys everything it touches. But the truth would surface. The truth would surface, his lawyer agreed. All of it, including your role, including your signature on those documents. You'd be trading survival for transparency. Joon-hyuk stared at the skyline he'd spent decades purchasing, building by building. Everything he'd accumulated, the power, the influence, the careful architecture of success, suddenly felt like borrowed clothing that had never fit. "What would you do?" he asked. His lawyer was quiet for a long moment. "I would survive," he said finally. "That's what I would do." The press conference happened at sunrise. Joon-hyuk stood at a podium he'd used 100 times for quarterly reports and acquisition announcements, facing cameras that captured something different in his face. Behind him, screens displayed documents he'd authorized to be released, financial structures, communication logs, the complete anatomy of corruption he'd unknowingly enabled. "I am responsible," he said simply. "Not for designing the system, not for profiting intentionally from its crimes, but for not seeing, for not asking, for signing documents that destroyed lives while I slept peacefully in apartments I bought with money I never examined." The questions came like artillery fire. He answered them all. Hours later, when the cameras had finally stopped, and his lawyers had stopped arguing and the building had emptied of everyone except ghosts and security guards, Joon-hyuk stood alone in his office and watched the sun set over a city that would never see him the same way. His phone buzzed. A news alert. International investigation expands, Park Industries disclosure triggers, multi-country probe into financial networks. Below it, another headline. Unnamed whistleblower's evidence corroborated by CEO's testimony. She'd built the fire. He'd given it oxygen. Together, they'd burned something that had survived decades of shadows. The trial lasted 14 months. Joon-hyuk testified for 17 days, transforming from accused to witness to something the prosecutors couldn't quite categorize. His cooperation didn't erase his culpability. He received a suspended sentence, substantial fines, permanent exile from corporate leadership. The company he'd built was dismantled and sold, its pieces scattered to buyers who promised reform. He moved into a small apartment in a neighborhood he'd never visited when he was rich enough to ignore such places. He learned to cook his own meals, wash his own clothes, exist in spaces that didn't bear his signature. Some mornings, he still woke reaching for documents that weren't there. Some nights, he still dreamed of rain and a woman who'd stood too still on a corner that led nowhere important. Nancy watched the verdict from a cafe in Lisbon. The news played on a mounted television, Korean characters scrolling beneath footage of a courtroom she'd never enter. She saw his face, thinner now, older, carrying weight that had nothing to do with pounds, and recognized something she'd placed there. Not guilt, not shame, purpose. He'd done what she'd hoped he would do. He'd chosen exposure over survival, truth over comfort, accountability over the careful architecture of ignorance that had protected him his entire life. She'd given him evidence. He'd given her something more difficult to name. The cafe was empty except for an old man reading a newspaper and a woman whose coffee had gone cold hours ago. Rain had started outside, soft, persistent, the kind that made everything gray and new. Nancy paid her bill with cash that couldn't be traced and walked into the wet afternoon, leaving no forwarding address. Somewhere across an ocean, a man she'd trusted was rebuilding a life from wreckage she'd helped create and he'd chosen to complete. They would never speak again, never meet again, never untangle the complicated gratitude and grief that lived in the space where their stories had intersected. But that was the nature of some connections, too brief to become ordinary, too profound to become forgettable. She'd arrived in his life like a wound. She'd left it like medicine. The distinction, she understood now, had never been hers to make. He saved her from ruin. She saved him from becoming the man he was afraid to be. Thank you for staying till the end. Most people click away, but you didn't, and that means something. Don't disappear now. Subscribe, stay close this year, and keep walking with us through these stories. Comment, share, and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you know today.